Thank you. What a beautiful, kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And I think we need to do that for the camera. And I want to just say a big thanks to you and the Heartland Institute for inviting me. I am excited to be here. I've talked to some of you now as you've been eating your lunch, and you're here for so many great reasons, and I'm just so excited that we can have this conversation today because it's such an important one for the future of our country. And I want to recognize Kendall, who I saw at the National Conference for State Legislatures last year when we were introducing the book there, and she said, we need to talk about this, and I said, let's do it, and that's one of the reasons we connected. So thank you all for this wonderful opportunity. National School Choice Week is this week, and last night in Chicago, we had the Whistle Stop Tour, and I was there as well, and it was fantastic. And I need to tell you, even with the rain, the cats and dogs that it was raining, you somehow had thousands of people at this Union Station, and what I could tell you about it, the one thing I can tell you about it is that it was all about passion. It was about passion. The students were there, the teachers were there, the supporters were there, and that's something that I find as a theme in this whole chartering movement in this country, and that is a passion that I often don't see in the other district public schools. And so it was just delightful to be there last night. And I really appreciate the fact that we can talk about some things together today. I want to start, I also wanted to thank the Illinois Network for Charter Schools here in Illinois because they had invited me to the rally last night, and I've really appreciated working with them as well. So this year is the 20th anniversary of charter schools in the nation. The first charter school opened in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1991. So it was 1991-92. This is the 20th anniversary year. I want to start off by just saying that my favorite story in my years of time as a state senator came from a charter school student. She sent me a letter, and she was a sixth grader in my district, and she said, now, Ember, or Senator, I guess she said, Senator, I know there is a governor and an attorney general and a state auditor, and then next on down are the legislators. So please, could you tell me just as soon as possible, is there anything lower than a legislator? I retired from the legislature a year later, not related. But I always appreciate it, and keeps you humble, doesn't it? The pioneering story of charter schools started a long time ago. You probably remember the 1983 report that came out from the Reagan administration, Nation at Risk. And a lot of people in the government were trying to figure out what can they do because they found a crisis in public education. Well, in that time period, some folks needed to respond. Well, the pioneering story of charter schools is really about people taking a stand for change, ordinary people taking a stand for change. And that is what I think makes it so very different. Today, the results of that happening back 20 years ago when ordinary people took a stand for change, the results today is that 2 million students now attend charter schools in 42 states around the country and the District of Columbia. 600,000 students are on waiting lists for charter schools. So think about it, 2 million students attending over 5,600 charter schools in all of those states. And this is what I think is most interesting. 2/3 of the American public supports chartering. Now, you might not know that from some of the controversy that has been out there, but in the recent Cap and Gallup poll in September of 2012, 2/3 of the nation supports charter schools. Now, I ask you, what else does 2/3 of the nation support right now during these divided times? And if you look at public school choice generally, over 70% support public school choice. The other interesting thing you may not realize is that every single presidential candidate from Bill Clinton, who you mentioned, on to every candidate since has supported charter schools. So there's something there for 20 years that has been really driving this. And again, it's ordinary people taking a stand for change. Now in Illinois, 1 out of 5 Chicago high school students attend a public charter school. I am told that 12.5% of the children in Chicago do attend public charter schools. Of the public school students attend public charter schools. That's a pretty darn good number. Washington, D.C. has 41% of their public school students attending charter schools. And New Orleans has the highest in the nation, and they're near 80%. They rebuilt after Hurricane Katrina, and charter schools became their norm after that to improve their education system. Today you have 124 total charter schools in Illinois with 110 in Chicago. I learned some of that last night. So, as I mentioned before, it started back with that nation at risk. Now, let's go to the origins of chartering. There are a couple things that led to the origins. The first being a very visionary governor who saw this. His name was Governor Rudy Perpich in Minnesota, and he was a Democrat. And he, in 1984, proposed something that was revolutionary. It was open enrollment public school choice, in response to a nation at risk, and also in response to his personal experience. Because when he, from northern Minnesota, moved to St. Paul to be in the legislature, his kids moved with him. And his students were doing just fine in their northern Minnesota school, but they were enrolled in the St. Paul school and they weren't doing so well, and he wanted to move them to another school, and he couldn't. So he introduced public school choice. Most of the governors at the time were talking about improving standards. He went to choice. It was revolutionary. Shortly thereafter, we passed the first post-secondary options in the country, which allowed high school students of 11th and 12th grade to attend college and get college credit at the same time they got high school credit. But open enrollment didn't pass because, as you might expect, it was a firestorm of protest. And then finally, it was kind of like it just happened. It passed because the attention had been diverted to other things. And in 1998, we were able to pass open enrollment. Well, I would tell you that Governor Rudy Perpich will never show up in the history books attached to charter schools. But without the passage of open enrollment, charter schools never would have happened. So he opened the door. So that was the first thing that occurred in Minnesota. The second thing that occurred may also surprise you. And that is, the first place that I ever heard the words charter schools came from a gentleman who was the head of the National Teachers Union, the American Federation of Teachers, Al Shanker. We had an education reform conference in Minnesota in 1988 after open enrollment had passed. And we were looking at what would be next. And Al Shanker was one of the speakers. And he talked about this notion of charter schools that he had written about in the New York Times. And the reason he was writing about charter schools is because he saw it as an empowerment of teachers. He saw it as a way to professionalize the teaching profession. And I heard it. And as a Democrat, I thought, this is a great opportunity. I'd love to give the teachers the power and the empowerment to do what they do best. And so it really got my attention. One of the things that Al Shanker told this group was something that I never forgot, and that is that, in his view, that school districts could take their customers for granted. It's true. They didn't have any choice to go anywhere else, and so there was no need to change. So that was the second thing that actually started with the origins of charter schools. And that night, after he spoke at that conference, a group of us sat around a table just like this with a little wine, and we wrote out what we thought a charter school would look like on a dinner napkin. So the truth of it is that charter school legislation started on a dinner napkin. You can use that in your next dinner conversation somewhere. So, third thing, what was the third thing that actually occurred? There was also a group that was working on education reform. They were looking at ways to improve public education. Remember, Nation at Risk was still really, really out there, and the public was quite outraged at what was going on in the public education system, which, by the way, is not the same thing today. It's not high on the agenda. It was like number 1 or 2 issues in the presidential campaigns back in the 80s. That's different now. It's unfortunate that's different now. But in any event, this group, these civic leaders, were coming together. There's a group in Minnesota called the Citizens League. So it was a task force of leaders from the business sector, nonprofit sector, education. There was a union leader on there, and they came together with a proposal for something they called charter schools. And that was the template for charter schools. Now, see, this was a group that was committed to the purchase of government services. That was a very novel idea back then, but the notion was that government doesn't necessarily have to be the only entity to deliver government services. You could hire or subcontract with others to actually deliver those services maybe differently or more efficiently. And so with that kind of background, charter schools evolved. Now, the key thing here, and I really hope that this message stays with you, is that charter schools came from outside the political system. It came from this very fine leadership group of people without a political agenda other than they just wanted to improve the public schools. I've always felt as a policymaker that the best thing you can do is to step back, remove the barriers, and let citizens take the lead. And that is really what's behind this notion of chartering and public school choice, as you well know. So why chartering? Why did it come to be? Well, this civic group and the supporters wanted to see a way where we could open up the K-12 public education system to provide options and innovations and to force the K-12 system to respond. Because as we heard, they really had control over the customers, right? And so how do you get the K-12 system to respond and to provide that flexibility and to be more responsive to the parents and teachers who want to do some different things? Well, it does that by allowing someone other than the school district to deliver public education. That is the definition of chartering. It's not a school. It's about allowing someone else other than the school district to deliver public education. So that means groups like teachers and parents, and the key was that they were choices outside the system. So it's a process of granting a charter that is chartering. I use a verb. Lots of people call it charter schools. It's not a school, it's a verb. And it's chartering the permission to deliver public education in this new and different way. But, of course, there's an exchange. And in return for granting that autonomy and that independence, well, the school leaders must commit to accountability. Accountability in their performance contract, in their charter contract. And they must live up to their performance commitments or the school can be closed. And that's the accountability. That's the accountability in chartering that does not exist in the district public schools. That's what's different. So charters trade regulation for results and bureaucracy for accountability. Now, the idea of opening up the K-12 system to this kind of change wasn't easy to pass in this legislature. And this is where the story that I write in Zero Chance of Passage becomes very, very personal. As you mentioned, I am a Democrat. And I was endorsed by the teachers' unions and had been endorsed for, I was in my second or third term at the time. The president of the Minnesota Federation of Teachers was a good friend of mine, had door knocked with me and was my constituent. Not only that, the lobbyist for the Minnesota Federation of Teachers was my 9th grade civics teacher. So this was pretty close, okay? Well, it took about 3 years to pass. Now I need to outline for you the political dynamics here. We were a majority at that time of Democratic farmer labor in both the House and the Senate. Significant Democratic farmer labor majorities. Notice labor being in the title of the party. Governor Rudy Perpich, who had been the champion for open enrollment in the 80s, now we were in the early 90s, had been defeated by Republican Governor Arne Carlson, who, ironically, had been endorsed by the other teachers' unions, the Minnesota Education Association, because Governor Rudy Perpich championed open enrollment. The new governor, Republican Governor Carlson, when he got into office in 1991, which is the year, by the way, charter schools passed, appointed as his education commissioner the lead lobbyist for the Minnesota Education Association. I paint this picture for you because you really need to understand the political dynamics through which the first charter school law passed. That was it in 1991. So we had been working on this for 2 years. Open enrollment had passed. We'd been working on it a few years. The legislature didn't get very far. But in 1991, there was building some support. Open enrollment was working really well. You know, when there's a constituency, that helps a lot. People out there, the parents were starting to get really excited about this. And so we had a huge battle. I will be clear about that. But what was interesting is that the unions did not really see that it was going to pass. And because it had been around for a couple years and it had been talked about, they didn't take it as a serious opportunity. And so in 1991, when it really was getting close to passage, we knew that we were building a little bit of support in the House of Representatives. The Senate had always been really strong on this. But what was very, very interesting is in the end we had to find a way to get it through the House of Representatives, which was very, very strongly opposed. There were three reasons why charter schools eventually passed over the resistance of the unions and a Democratic farmer-labor majority. The first is that it was very much bipartisan. Very much. It would never have passed without basically people from both parties coming together and making it happen. Just like what you saw recently on the fiscal cliff legislation nationally, this was an instance where the minority had the majority of votes on it. So a couple things had to happen. Number one, on the vote that occurred, 42% of the Democrats, the majority Democrats, voted for the charter schools on the crucial vote. 56% of the minority Republicans voted for it, and it passed by 3 votes. There is one other key here. You had to have a friendly Speaker of the House who was pro-education reform. Nobody knew it at the time, but he played a very significant role in this way. When that vote came up, and we were all just biting our nails as to whether this is going to pass, he is the only person who knows the vote count. And so he knew, and nobody knew where he stood. And all of a sudden, he just closed the roll, and it passed by 3 votes. 10 members had not voted. The Speaker has the power to close the roll whenever he wants to. So it passed with a significant minority of the Democrats, a majority of the Republican minority, okay, and a friendly Speaker by 3 votes. Well, that gives you the sense it was very much bipartisan, and that truly has, I think, sustained chartering for 20 years. It came from the middle of the political spectrum, it was bipartisan, and it came from outside the political spectrum. And all of those things, I think, have really caused it to survive. Now, the thing is, today, I don't think that chartering would ever pass in Congress or in a state, the original bill, because we're too divided as a nation. There aren't a lot of moderates out there anymore, which is what brought this together. And so I would suggest that this is the way we can pass these big ideas, is to bring people together. The second thing is that it was severely compromised. As I wrote in my book, and I actually started out this way, I was devastated when the bill passed. I'd worked for 3 years as the author. I had fought with the unions. I had had to break with my friends. It was painful. I can only tell you it was painful. And then at the very end, it had to be compromised in order to pass. And for 20 years, I just always wondered that if I hadn't have compromised, could it have been better? Could we have avoided some of the controversy? And ironically, in writing this book and interviewing 20 or 15 of the players in this book 20 years later, I found out something I never realized. It would never have passed if it hadn't compromised. It just never would have passed. It wouldn't have had those 3 votes. And so in the end, the lesson learned is compromise is not defeat. And that is really what I learned from my colleague, who told me in the middle of this, when he was bringing the conference committee chair, was bringing it to me and said, this is all we're going to be able to do. And I'm saying, no, you can't. He said, Ember, pigs get fed and hogs get slaughtered. Yeah. So I had to take it, because we all knew that by now the unions were very much aware of what we were doing, and we would never get another chance. And so we got it passed by 3 votes. And to my enormous surprise, this very weak bill, which they were still trying to kill, by the way, and that's how it still only passed by 3 votes, even in this weak form. To my enormous surprise, within 2 weeks after the passage of the bill, our U.S. Senator from Minnesota, David Durenberger, took it national and made a statement 2 days later on the floor of the United States Senate and talked about this bill that passed, this new charter school bill, and the bipartisan coalition that helped to pass it. And then 2 weeks later, when the governor did sign the bill, and he had to sign the bill because it was part of the education budget bill. That was the other thing that saved it. It was one piece of a big, big bill. When he signed it, out came a statement from the then Democratic Leadership Council, which was quite influential at that time. The chair of the Democratic Leadership Council at that time, who wrote this press release lauding the bipartisan passage of charter schools and public school choice, was Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas. One of the things I learned as I was writing this book, as I interviewed some of my DLC colleagues from D.C., is something I never knew, and that is that Governor Clinton had been talking about charter schools for 9 months prior to the time it passed in Minnesota. Because those visionaries I talked about from the Citizens League, one being Ted Coldery, had written a paper about it, and we got it to the DLC and they put it in Bill Clinton's hands, and he took that and took it around the country as part of the DLC agenda. You know, I never knew that, and it's probably best I didn't, because if I knew that all these moderate, centrist Democrats were supporting charter schools, it wouldn't have helped me because the Democrats in Minnesota are very liberal. So it might have hurt it. So it's all happening, and I had no idea. But this is what was happening with Senator Durenberger on the Republican side and Governor Clinton on the Democratic side. They were taking it national because they saw it as a centrist alternative to what was going on in the national debate. Remember, the public is outraged. They're looking for solutions. And on the one hand, you had George H.W. Bush in his presidency advocating for private school vouchers. And on the other side, you had the House Democrats advocating for basically no change. And so this was right down the middle. And that's why it caught the attention of the nation when it passed. This very compromised bill that I thought would never start a charter school, ever. So this was really the beginning of the national conversation. However, back in Minnesota, back at the ranch, we've now passed a law, and now you've got to get the school boards to get kind of interested in this, right? Because one of the compromises was that only the school boards could start a charter school, no other authorizers. Well, as I feared, and as I had told my colleagues that I thought would happen, the school boards rejected the applications for charter schools, right? In fact, they rejected the first 7 of 9 charter school applications. The only 2 that got through, one was City Academy, the first charter school in the nation that opened in 1992, because it served students who had basically not finished high school, not completed high school, so it was a second chance opportunity. So the school districts didn't feel very threatened by that. The other school that opened was the Metro Deaf School, which served a very special population of students who were deaf and hard of hearing. So all of that was just showing the resistance that the school boards had, and as one of the state officials said at the time, it was by having only the school boards as the authorizer, it was like the fox guarding the chickens, and it was. And so because of that, they created our opportunity to then come back and amend the legislation 2 years later to make it so that we'd have more authorizers, and we had the State Board of Education as an authorizer, and we were able to improve our law over the coming years just because what happened, the history showed that to be the case. Well, now today I'm proud to say that the Minnesota law is the model for the nation. It's #1 in the listing and the rankings by the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools and still is there. Illinois is number 28. There's 2 reasons why the Illinois charter law is not up with the top ranked ones. #1 is I think you still have a cap, is that not right? Mm-hmm. And the cap is very much a problem in the limitation of charters. And secondly, you have very limited authorizers. Now I know you have just gotten a new commission that is going to be an alternative to the school boards, but both of those areas are the areas that are very weak in the law and what I think can hold back chartering on a policy level. I want to just say, though, that over the years, chartering has evolved in many ways. The laws have evolved in various states. I love that. But I'm going to go back to the teachers and the unions because I know that we had some conversations about that earlier. The teachers' unions in Minnesota have evolved too, and so have I. And actually, as I wrote this book, I interviewed the teacher unions leaders that were so hostily against this bill. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot from them that I didn't maybe understand at the time. They too wanted to make the teaching profession more of a profession. That was what they were doing. They wanted to do that. And chartering was just a sort of, it was just more than they could grab at the time. But these teacher unions leaders were actually pretty much reformers, and I'll tell you why. Because 20 years later, they've come up against, in the Minneapolis school district, resistance to the things they want to do. And so they finally decided 20 years later that they needed themselves to become a charter school authorizer. And in Minnesota, last year, the state approved the first union-initiated, teacher union-initiated charter school authorizer in the nation. So there is a way to bring people together on this, and they now are authorizing charter schools, particularly that empower teachers and do things that they think are what should be done in public education. I want to just really begin to end this just in a couple things, and then I really want to get to the questions and the comments and the conversation. Across the nation right now, I think a number of things we need to do to grow and strengthen chartering. We need well-trained authorizers. We need well-trained governing boards. We need well-prepared charter school leaders. We need equitable per-pupil funding. We need better access to financing and building facilities. And it's this last one where I've taken a lot of my volunteer time as a board member of Charter Schools Development Corporation, which is the leading nonprofit provider of financing and development of charter school facilities in the nation. And they happened to be, they were kind enough to partner with me to co-publish my book, Zero Chance of Passage. And it's been really, really helpful because this way I've been able to get this message out about charter schools, because the more we can improve the climate for charter schools, the more everyone will be able to move forward. I wrote this book to dispel the myths about chartering. When you look at the title of the book, Zero Chance of Passage, that came, by the way, from my House member who was the leader of the bill on the House side. And she was a Democrat from suburban Minneapolis. And when she was interviewed 20 years later, she was asked, what did you think when Ember gave you the bill? And she responded to my interviewer, I had zero confidence it would pass. So that was my lead legislator colleague. Well, that is just something that people do not recognize in this, is that that this was a Democratic initiative. It did overcome a lot of resistance. And what's happened around the country is that there have been a lot of myths about chartering. And I have been very pleased that my book, Zero Chance of Passage, has been able to be used by those involved in chartering as a board development tool and as a staff development tool, so that those involved in chartering today can learn more about what it was like back then and understand some of these points, because they really create a different a whole different story if you understand some of the origins of it. And so many of these folks, and they're my favorite audience, is to get these books to these folks, work with them so that they can tell the story to the media, recruit families with the origins. I go around the country and I cannot tell you how many people tell me that they know the story of charter schools. It came from the right, came from the left, it came from here. I mean, I hear these things. I was in Georgia in October to help with the passage of the referendum, and it was very much a divided political fight. The Republicans supported it, the Democrats did not. So I went down there to say, wait a minute, even the NAACP was against this passage of this constitutional amendment to expand chartering, when they had been one of the biggest supporters of charter schools in Minnesota. And communities of color generally have been very supportive of charter schools in Minnesota and around the country. So I had to go to Georgia as a Democrat to talk about the bipartisan middle, that sort of thing. So with that, I look forward to the questions, and my last hope is that I hope that you can be inspired by this story, because many of you are coming through in these battles as well, and that you can take this story in your own stand for change. And I really want to work with you to continue this battle, to continue this for the future of public education in Minnesota and the nation. Thank you. Oh, is it rubbing? Okay. I'm sorry, were you getting a lot of noise? I'm so sorry. All right. All right. Please, I will take questions, conversation. Yes, please.
The charter school has been in place for 20 years. Has there been a study done to track the success of the children who have gone through the charter schools?
Yes. I mean, you have a study that can support everything. I mean, you really can, in Minnesota and in the nation, depending on who and what it is. Remember that charter schools are a process. And so one of the things I talk about in the book and otherwise is that comparing charter schools to district public schools does not really make sense given the origins of it. A Montessori school can be a charter school or it can be a district school. So it really, to compare that doesn't really make a lot of sense. What does make sense is to look at what's working in both of the schools, both the public charter schools and the public district schools. Focus on that and make sure we can do more of that. And if it's not working, to make sure that we either close the school or we eliminate it. So that's really where I have come. These studies have created, I think, a false debate in the country, and it's unfortunate. And part of what I want to do with this book is recreate that debate. Yes?
You spoke about the advantage of choice and how it freed up people to, not just be captive to the one provider of education, and charter schools help to do that. But I guess I would want to take that one step further. Why couldn't the money follow the child to any school, charter school or private school? And so my question to you would be, I know you focused on charter schools and chartering, but sometimes it's seen that these two movements, one towards what might be called full school choice and the others towards charter schools, are somehow contradictory. Do you see them as fighting against each other, or are they complementary paths to the same thing? And how do you see these, sometimes the groups are different, they have different proposals. How do you see them working together, or is there a natural problem between them?
I think that they're all about choice, and they're parental choice, and so some parents opt for private choice, some opt for public choice, whatever suits them and their children. There's a difference between chartering and private school choice in this regard. We, from the origins, the visionaries, viewed chartering as a way to, shall we say, create new schools. In other words, new schools was what was going to make the K-12 system respond. And so private schools are already existing schools. So the option was to create new, it was like to be the research and development sector of public education. And by having it be public, it was a way then, because they have the same accountability rules, that those innovations that occurred in the charter school could be transferred more easily to the K-12 public schools. So the notion behind chartering was different than behind private schools, vouchers. And it really was about creating the new school against or in competition with the public schools. And this is something that Senator David Durnberger talks about a lot in my book. He was a voucher supporter at the time, but he grabbed onto this because he saw it as a political reality that this could pass. He could see that this could pass, whereas it was a very difficult reality to have private school choice pass at the time.
You mentioned that the unions in Minnesota last year were able to be part of the approvers of charter schools.
Authorizer, right?
Authorizer. Have they authorized any? One, and if they do, are those schools unionized?
Question, I'll repeat it for the camera. So you want to know about the teacher union authorizer. Have they done any, have they authorized any charter schools? The answer is they're in the process right now. They just were approved last year, and so they're getting the applications. And the second, are they unionized? I don't know the answer to that question yet, but in the Minnesota law, any charter school can unionize. That's okay. There's just not a requirement for them to be in the collective bargaining agreement of the district. They want their own, and some do. They do become unionized, and that's perfectly welcome. Yes.
When you really step back and look at the big picture, the big problem in America, this is my view, I'm just going to preface this a little bit, is that you have this district bureaucracy that has far too many people, bond deals, roofing deals, building deals, all this other stuff. Do you see a danger with the expansion of charter schools of the charter apparatus becoming as bureaucratized, where instead of having a bloated school district like Chicago, for example, you have a bloated charter district like Green Dot, or that all you're really doing is shifting the district bureaucracy from boundary lines, which we all agree probably is a bad idea, to basically just shifting the bureaucracy to charters. And isn't there a little bit of a danger? I noticed in one of the things you said, access to the same municipal bonds, that's either great because you get to build charter schools cheaper, or it's really bad because you get to have charter schools get in on the bonding schemes that are bankrupting states like Illinois. Is there a danger there? And if so, how do you prevent that danger?
Yes, there is a danger. The question being, can charter schools become as sort of bureaucratic, if you will, as a system as the district schools? There is a danger, and it's occurring. And part of that is because sometimes charter schools, once they have their own support and constituency, nobody wants to close them either, even when they're not performing. And so really that's why I went back to saying training authorizers and those governing boards, they need to understand when they're not performing, they need to be closed and be held accountable. Accountability is the key to chartering. And I am afraid of this, and I know that some of the folks at the National Convention, Mayor Cory Booker, Howard Fuller, and some others have raised that very point. Chartering really are you have both the ma and pa kinds of charter schools, and then you have the systems. And so we have to be careful about bureaucratizing that. As far as the facilities part of it that you mentioned, the problem is that facilities are charters are at such a disadvantage on facilities almost anywhere in the country. They don't get the funding that the district schools get, or the district schools say you can't use our buildings or whatever. So it's really a different situation for them that they have to overcome. And so I'm not sure what's happening in Illinois on bonding, but it is very much an issue that is specific to each state. Yes.
Thanks for coming. I Googled you. I told you
yes.
before I mentioned that Christine comes up on YouTube. It's you doing the tango.
I know. I am a ballroom dancer. It's true.
I too went to the rally. It was great. About 2,000 people there for school choice. I support school choice. So I have three issues that you haven't really touched on. I want limited government, less taxes. I pay a huge amount of taxes. I have a real estate business. So I need less money spent on education, which is teacher compensation you didn't really talk about. So specifically, with Chicago in mind, I want no public sector unions anywhere. So that's where I'm going. Secondly, I want no government pensions. I want IRAs, 401ks, which is a huge problem in Illinois. Everyone's talking about it except the politicians. And thirdly, I really want vouchers. So specifically, can you comment on elimination of the unions, Illinois pensions, and vouchers?
Those are all very much a part of the general conversation about public education and private education, very much beyond the chartering aspect of it. So I really hesitate to comment on those kinds of issues, except to say this. I really believe that teachers, that there are many, many good teachers out there. And I believe that compensation is one that where you can get outcomes. If you can get outcomes, I really believe in compensation. And so it's about tying the compensation to the outcomes in the contract and in the achievement of the students. And so in that regard, in the voucher situation, I think that many different states are dealing with it. I don't know the details on that, so I really am hesitant to go into those broader issues here. But I believe there's room for everything here, and there's room for a lot of different ideas. My question is, where can we come together? Where can we come together? Because that's how we're going to improve public education, and that's what I'm about. Yes.
If you have a charter school authorizer that's misbehaving and not holding its schools accountable, can they be shut down?
If you have a charter school that's...
If you have a charter school authorizer that's not holding its schools accountable, can they be held accountable by being shut down themselves in their schools with them possibly, or the schools that are performing sold to someone else? And who would do the shutting down?
So who's guarding the authorizers is kind of your question, right? If they're not doing their job. That is and has been a real issue. And I will say that as the author of the original bill, we didn't think a lot about authorizers. And I think that's one of the gaps that we discovered as the years went on. We didn't do a lot about training of authorizers or holding them accountable. Now, at the Minnesota law, we have put things in the law that really does require them to be much more formal about these things and much more accountable. And to be honest, some of the authorizers in Minnesota have decided not to do it anymore. And, but this is the way it needs to go, and that makes the law that we have, again, a strong law. In Minnesota, by the way, we have, as authorizers, higher education institutions. We have nonprofits of $3 million or more. Volunteers of America of Minnesota has about nearly 20 schools that they authorize, and an Audubon Society group, an environmental group, has I think nearly 30 charter schools that it authorizes. So the nonprofit sector has been very valuable in this and has allowed for more diversity and innovation. Yes?
Before this began, we had a brief discussion, and you said you were not a fan of vouchers, of school vouchers. You know, a lot of people argue this on this side or the other, but that at least has the virtue of allowing the money to follow the child, which is a principle that a lot of people in the school choice movement adhere to. What's your problem with vouchers?
I think I addressed that earlier in the sense that the whole charter idea was about creating new schools with new innovation and new research and development, which you really can't do by just funding the existing system of private schools. As far as the money following the child, I do agree with that, and chartering does that very thing. It allows the money to follow the child. However, if the accountability standards are not the same, then it's not the same playing field. And that's why the charter innovations wouldn't transfer as well to, let's say, the private schools, or the private school innovations wouldn't transfer as well to the district schools. So for me, that is why I had why I view them as very different.
What do you mean the accountability standards aren't the same?
That the standards for, certainly in Minnesota, and I'm not an expert, but certainly in Minnesota, that they are not held to the same state standards in the academic standards as are the public schools.
I mean, just not to argue with you, but so what? I mean, it's the parents' choice. As parents can decide, the parents hold the schools accountable. Why isn't that good enough?
Well, from my perspective, I think there does need to be that accountability. I also think that the issue for me is also separation of church and state. So as a Democrat, those are some of the issues that I have held for quite, just as part of my personal philosophy. And I agree that, that there are many ways to look at that and many different points of view. Yeah.
You mentioned that the NAACP was opposed to, I guess, chartering, and there's I guess, a divergence in the African-American community. It seems to be that the ordinary African-American citizen supports school choice, vouchers, or chartering versus the African-American establishment, civil rights establishment, and the political leaders who support the teachers union. Can you, or have you come across, I guess, in your research and endeavors, have you come across some plausible explanation as to why the leaders in the African-American community seem to be at such odds with the constituents?
I saw that in Georgia, really did. And it really was the influence of the unions in that case. I have not seen what that division is. What I've seen in my experience in Minnesota has been that that there has been a huge acceptance of the need for creating choices in the neighborhoods where the children live. When we had open enrollment, you could, for example, attend a school across the city if you had the resources to travel over there every day. But the communities of color and low-income communities were concerned that they didn't get those choices. And so the whole notion that they wanted was to create the choices in the neighborhoods where the children were. And so some of our highest performing schools in Minnesota have been in the African American neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods. Some of the top schools have been in those communities. I can't really speak to that, but I am very much a supporter of BAO and other organizations that are out there, you know, beating the bushes for more chartering and more choice. You bet. So I want to make sure I get, okay, I don't know how much time we have. Go ahead.
First, thank you.
You bet.
For the presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I wonder how much in your thinking about this whole subject you have studied the results of parochial private schools, where typically for about 1/3 the cost, they're graduating 98% of their students, and they're going on and succeeding either in high schools or college. Because you're talking about results. There's the results right there for all of us. I believe in California, some of the public schools are even trying to emulate the experience of the private and parochial schools.
Interesting. Interesting.
1/3 the cost and much higher graduation rates. How do those things factor into your thinking?
You know, I think we need to learn from each other. That's what I think. And if there's that kind of data, we need to understand what they're doing right. I want to focus on what's being done right and see what we can do to replicate that in the school systems. I'd love to look at that, but it's not something that I've been expert in. So. Yes.
Well, first, I just wanted to plug myself. I work for the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, so if anybody has questions specifically about authorizers, I'm happy to stay for a couple minutes and talk to you. But I also wanted to go back to the idea of accountability for authorizers. In a lot of states, that's now allowed by law to the Departments of Education or the state boards of education. That's something that NACSA is really pushing for, because the bottom line is when you look at where are those underperforming charters that have to be closed down, and I mean, that's a big deal. National associations like the Alliance and like NACSA pushing for closing those bad schools, they're with poor performing authorizers. So that's one thing. And the other thing is just me personally as a taxpayer, it matters to me if a private school is accountable to me, because those are my tax dollars following them. My tax dollars aren't funding my daughter's school. They're funding everybody's school out of a common pot. So, you know, I went to Catholic school, but if my kid is in public school, then my neighbor's kid can go to private school, fine, but that private school better be performing for those kids. They're accountable to me.
I do want to say that your organization, the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, is an outstanding organization and really came about because of the need for authorizers to have this training and this experience and share best practices. And it has really improved the authorization of charter schools in the nation. So very grateful to it, and it really goes to your question earlier. Yes. 2 more, he says. All right, please.
What is your response to the argument against charter schools? The typical one I hear is that you're draining resources from the school districts and the top students. So it's the students that need technically the most money to get them help, and the school districts don't have the money because it's in the charter schools.
Two answers to that question, about the question being, are the charter schools draining the money from the public school system? Number one, ironically, you'll find that in the data on chartering in Minnesota and the nation, that many charter schools serve special needs students, high proportions of special needs, high proportions of communities of color. So actually, they're not draining. In fact, they're actually serving many of those students. But secondly, it goes to what you said earlier, money follows a student. I remember when a leader in Minnesota stood up, an African-American leader, and was very concerned with the Minneapolis public schools, saying, show me the money. Basically, he was saying that the money's not coming to my school in African-American North Minneapolis. It's going over to your favorite projects over here. Well, you see, this follow the money means that really this. The superintendent gets to decide where the money goes in the Minneapolis public school districts, and it might not go to the schools where the children actually deserve to have the full amount. But if you actually send the full amount to that charter school, they will get the benefit of it. And that's what I mean by it follows the money to the student and not is decided by the superintendent, for example. And the last one, please.
I just, two questions. I don't know if you were aware, like here in Chicago, there's massive project funding into the charter schools. UNO, soccer, $50 million new facility. So there is money going to the charter school. And that the effect they have on the Catholic school, inner city Catholic schools, where this beautiful new place, funded by taxpayers, is free, with definitely no better performance than what's going on. And the Catholic schools are $2 or $3 grand, and they empty out and shut. So I don't know if that went in your kid, that they do have, and they're both citizens of the United States. And I just wondered if you guys had factored that in, that these schools that have served the urban poor for many, many years have been shutting in huge numbers, because they do cost a little bit, even though they had a history of results.
You mean the Catholic schools shutting? Is that what you're saying?
Independent schools.
Right.
I sold my business,
Yeah.
bought a Catholic school with my own money, and run an inner city high school and put my own kids in it. So I'm really on the ground. Chicago
Sure.
Academy.
Yeah.
We were approved to become a charter school and didn't take the money because they said you can't have chapel. So we're on our own, and which is fine, because we've been able to do. But it does. I didn't know if because I'm for charters and I'm for choice, but I think where everybody in this Heartland would be more of okay, than any choice. If you want to go to a Jewish school or a Catholic school, you can, the money can follow you. I think that's what a lot of Heartland does. What are your thoughts on the impact? Did you guys ever think that the impact would shut low-income Catholic schools, because it has, because new charter school with government money, they're like, wow, look at that, look at UNO, look at that. And so why go to St. Mary's when it's a 100-year-old building, even though the education might be excellent?
The question being, did we ever think about that it might have an impact on closing some of the existing Catholic schools or parochial schools? Actually, we didn't. We saw the private school system as being very robust and very vibrant, and that the public school system needed, you know, to have that stimulation. So no, we didn't think of it in that regard. You know, I respect that this organization has a support of both the vouchers and the charter schools. I would just simply say that what's interesting is that, and you're right, the parochial schools have been reducing the numbers now, and more are going to charters, and you are right about that. Some of them are actually converting to charters. But I'm also told by some in the Catholic community that without the charter school model, they would be gone totally. I mean, at least they have an option for the students that they were serving, and that they are going to that model. I think it might just be an issue of lack of resources. I don't know. But bottom line is, I think we really just want to do what is best for kids, and I want people to have as many choices as they can have. Sure, they're all going to be competing a little bit, but parents know what's best for them, and they'll make the choice themselves. So I want to really thank you very, very much. It's been a wonderful, wonderful audience. Thank you.